Today, we are starting our first episode for Central Asia podcast. And today, I'm joined with Dr. Kamran Bokhari, Senior Director at the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy. Dr. Bokhari is one of the leading voices on the geopolitics of the Middle East, of Central Asia, and the broader Eurasia space. His recent work has traced the profound shifts underway as Iran internal erosions create both challenges and opportunities for its neighbors, from South Caucasus to South Caucasus to Central Asia. Dr. Bukhari analysis sits at the intersections of what we at the Central Asia Center are talking right now about, which is the S7 initiatives. How can Central Asian states leverage this moment of regional flux to chart a more autonomous course? Today, we will be primarily focusing on how Iran domestic turmoil, the weakening of Russian influence, the rise in Turkish ambitions are really reshaping the strategic geopolitical calculus for the entire region. So, Dr. Bukhari, thank you so much for joining us and welcome to our first podcast.
Good to be on the first podcast. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Thank you. So the first section of this conversation really start to understand what's going on in Iran. I've read some of the pieces that you've wrote about the situation in Iran, and you've written a very important, and you mentioned on these pieces that the foundations of the Iranian regimes are eroding, and you mentioned that will continue to do so for a long time. Can you help us understand what are the key indicators that you are really watching for to come up with that conclusion about this structural decline rather than a temporary political crisis?
So the Iranian regime is facing what many would call a polycrisis. It has multiple crises, uh, playing out. So number one is that public anger against the regime is at an all-time high. And the best estimates that we have for regime support within the public basically doesn't exceed, say, 20%, and that's really pushing it. So there's the hardcore sort of constituency of the regime that it's relying on. That's the base. Pretty much everybody else is opposed to the regime. Now, these people don't all agree on what to do with the regime or how to go about challenging the regime or having sort of bringing about political transformation. So we have a large body, good 70-80% of the population that for different reasons opposes the regime. Some of them are not interested in sort of ideology, but for them, the day-to-day living has become a challenge, to put it mildly, given the economic downturn. So you have, in other words, public disaffection at an all-time high that's been compounded by a very bad economic situation where basic services, basic necessities are not being able to be met. And the biggest sort of proof of that was the plunge of the rial, which last year in the beginning was going for like 875,000 rials to $1. When the year ended and we saw the latest round of, and it triggered the latest round of unrest, that exchange rate had gone to 1.45 million rials. So that, brought the merchant class onto the streets organizing protests. But then again, then others who oppose the regime and have other constituencies joined in and it became much bigger. Then there is intra-elite fighting. And there are multiple power centers, multiple factions within sort of what we would call the conservative establishment. And these are military factions, factions of clerics, factions of politicians, and it's a really messy situation. And then there are multiple institutions that have been grafted over the republic that are competing for power. So the most important is, of course, the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps that has been sort of the center of gravity of the Islamic Republic. But we are seeing its weakening, have seen it, especially in the last 2 years. And we see the rise of, or the rising influence of, the regular armed forces, which is a parallel military institution. Then there are sanctions, and this regime is under external pressure, especially from the United States, because of its nuclear program, because of its ballistic missile capabilities. It suffered huge losses at the hands of Israel since 2024. So we have a very complicated situation that the regime is trying to manage. The regime, despite these weaknesses, appears to have the ability to put down or quell agitation on the streets, of course, using massive levels of, brutality, and therefore that it can do, but it cannot change the situation. It cannot turn it around without reforms. Now, the reforms are very, very difficult because of the internal factionalization, and of course, in order to make good on the reforms, it needs to do a deal with the United States so that sanctions are, they gain sanctions respite, and they can start to, provide for economic easing on the home front. So it's a really complicated situation, both on the domestic and the foreign policy.
So you discussed something important about how the United States pressure can really play an important role and an important role in these sanctions. I want to talk and discuss more in details with you about the spillover effect of the crisis in Iran that we are all aware of. So your recent piece talks about how the crisis in Iran and the situation of the United States and the impact can really change the relationship to its western, northern, and eastern frontier when it comes to Iran. You talk about how Turkey right now are facing many challenges, including the Iranian Kurdish factions that seeking to exploit Tehran instability, considering those challenges within the country. And you already highlighted the divisions. Could we see a contentious Kurdish zone emerge from Syria through Iraq into Iran? What would that mean for the regional stability?
So strategically speaking, and from a Kurdish national security point of view, that is sort of what would be the worst case scenario, that you have a situation where you're still trying to deal with the Syrian Kurds, and that conflict is playing itself out in real time, where the Kurds are trying to preserve their autonomy, and the new government in Damascus, backed by Turkey, is trying to limit that autonomy. So that's still a very raw and unfolding dynamic. Now, the Iranian regime, you swing over to Iran, the Iranian regime's weakening is an opportunity for many Kurdish groups. There are at least four key Kurdish rebel groups that are fighting the Iranian regime, and we saw some of that take place in the recent unrest. And there are reports that most of the violence that the regime used, or the bulk of it, to put down the unrest and the agitation, took place in the Kurdish areas. So from a Turkish point of view, is the Iranian government going to be able to hold its own where the Kurds do not achieve sort of freedom of operation? So that's that. Then we know that the Iraqi government, since the fall of Saddam, has increasingly fallen into the Iranian orbit because of the dominance of the Shia factions who are beholden to Iran, both political and militant factions. And then, of course, Iran exercises a lot of influence over at least one Kurdish faction in the north, the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan. And so if Iran's influence is receding and the Shia government, destabilizes, or even if it doesn't destabilize, a reduction in Iranian ability to manage Iraq provides for Iraqi Kurds more space to operate. So they will push for demands that Baghdad has not been able to, or has refused to accept from the Kurds. So whether it's revenue sharing, oil production, exports, and in essence, a full political economic power sharing. So you can expect the Kurds And the Kurds in Iraq are divided between the two main factions, PUK-1 that I already mentioned, and then the KDP, the Kurdistan Democratic Party, that leans more towards Turkey. And so you have a very fragile situation. So it almost becomes, if this is not managed well, if somehow the Iranian regime continues to weaken, that has a spillover effect into Iraq. Syria is already in play. So the fear of the Turks is that their entire sort of southeastern flank becomes then an unmanageable conflict zone. And so this is sort of one example of that spillover of the weakening of the Iranian state.
That's very helpful. Thank you so much. If you were to think about also the spillover when it comes to the northern side of Iran, if you were to take the questions and maybe think about Azerbaijan, Azerbaijan has really emerged as a middle power of Iran border. You write about this really about, you say that Baku sees both risk, refugees flows, and opportunity when it comes to the Iranians, Azeris gaining influence in Tehran. How is Azerbaijan positioning itself considering this political environment in Iran? And where do you think it's going to be really taking a place or position there?
Great question. So from the point of view of the Azerbaijanis, this situation in Iran is both a threat and an opportunity. No government likes, even if it doesn't agree with its neighboring government and has hostile relations, the last thing they want is for that government to weaken to the point
Right.
where there is no control anymore, central control in the country, and refugees are spilling over, all sorts of militant activities taking place, a rebellion is taking place. So that is sort of the worst case scenario from the point of view of Baku. It does not want to see all of that come northwards, especially in this current moment when it just regained its territories back from Armenia in the 2020-23 conflict. And now they're moving towards a peace agreement that the White House is mediating. Vice President J.D. Vance is due to go to Baku and Erevan, I think next week or the following week. And so in this moment, this is the last thing that the Azerbaijanis want, is for trouble south of the border to spill into their territory. Now, I'm not saying that that will happen, but when strategists and foreign policymakers look at situations, they have to operate from a worst case scenario and then work their way backwards. So
Right.
this is sort of the threat situation. And the reason for that is that the largest minority, ethnic minority in Iran, are the Azeris.
Right.
And they comprise as many as a quarter of all of the 93 million people of Iran. And so, and this, unlike the Kurds and the Arabs in the southwest and the Baloch in the southeast or the Turkmens in the northeast, the Azeris have not had a tradition of rebellion against the state. So they don't have separatist groups per se. Instead, what they've done is they are very well integrated into the political mainstream, if you will. Even in this regime, you see many top elite members who are Azeri. The supreme leader is Azeri, ethnically. The president is Azeri. The head of the regular armed forces is Azeri. I believe the defense minister is also Azeri. And so you can see how the Azeris are integrated. Now, that sort of leads me to the opportunity for Azerbaijan. The opportunity is that Azerbaijan would like to see a friendly government in Tehran. Now, obviously, it does not have the ability to influence that much because it has been challenged historically with its own preoccupation with the conflict with Armenia and Iran traditionally, historically siding with Armenia. So there have been hostile relations. And then, of course, a majority of Iranians follow the Shia faith, the Shia Muslim faith. Likewise, as many as 65% of all Azeris follow the Shia faith. Although culturally very different, they're not the same. but there is that. And the Iranians historically used that sort of cross-border sectarian reality to export their religion northwards. For the longest time, they were not able to do it because this was part of the Soviet Union. And then in 1991, when Azerbaijan gained independence, it was an opportunity for the Iranian regime to try and push its influence, just like it expanded into, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Lebanon. It was trying to do the same thing with Azerbaijan. The insulation that Azerbaijan had is that it's a completely secular society. It's also a Russified society. It was part of the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union for almost a century, a good 70 years, 75, 80 years. And still the influence of the Kremlin is there. So that insulated the Azerbaijani state, but it still had a hostile regime on its southern flank. So if the regime is going to change, the question on the minds of the Azerbaijanis is, will it change for the better? And can the Iranian Azeris, who tend to be more of a reformist bent, more, if you will, moderate, and even many are secular, can they play a bigger role in shaping the new regime in Iran? And they understand it's a process. It will not happen anytime soon. It's a long drawn out process. And it's not really guaranteed that it will lead to a positive outcome. But that's sort of the opportunity here for Azerbaijan.
So the question about Azerbaijan, and you talked about the bulge, the insurgency bulge. You talked about Taliban, and we didn't talk yet about Pakistan. Those three elements here, Taliban, Pakistan, and bulge insurge, considered source of instability across the Iranian borders. You talk in your pieces about destabilization. You suggest destabilization could spread in both directions. Is that the worst scenario here that we already talked about it, or is there any other possible worst case scenario that we need to highlight?
And so each border is different. So as we just discussed, the Kurds and what will happen to the Shia factions in Iraq. That's one border. We just discussed about Azerbaijan because that's the northwestern border.
Right.
The most sort of fragile situation is on the border with Pakistan. The reason for that is that on both sides of the border, there is an ethnic Baloch minority.
Right.
Iranian Baloch are not are culturally and ideologically and politically different from the Baloch on the Pakistani side. The Baloch on the Pakistani side are tribal, they are ethno-nationalists, and they're been fighting an insurgency for decades, which has become, in recent years, has become a bigger problem for Pakistan as Pakistani state has weakened over the last 20, 25 years. And that's not the only insurgency on Pakistan's western flank. There's the Baloch are on the southwest along the Iranian border, but they also have the Taliban insurgency on their side of the border with Afghanistan. So this entire western flank for Pakistan is very vulnerable. Now, on the other side of this border inside Iran, you have a Baloch minority that has traditionally had armed rebel groups that have been fighting the Islamic Republic. And it's not just an ethnic, if you will, struggle or cause. There's definitely the ethnic part, but there's also the fact that Iranian Baloch are not Shia, they're Sunni. And they're not only Sunni, they're prominent rebel groups like Jundullah in the past, Jaish al-Adl in more recent years. They're Islamist groups. So these are Sunni Islamist groups who share ideology with the Taliban, if you will. And then this entire region is also a sort of a thoroughfare. If you connect, Afghanistan to Pakistan and Iran, that tri-border area, it's a thoroughfare for organized crime, criminal elements, syndicates. It is also a thoroughfare for groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And so this has been a very bad place, the southeast, the Sistan và Balochistan province. This is been a problem for the Iranians for decades. Now, let's say the Iranian regime weakens, we can expect that this is one of the areas which will see a lot of uprising. And depending on how weak the government's ability is to impose its writ, will determine the scale of the uprising, which could have a spillover effect onto the Pakistani side. So this becomes almost like a cross-border phenomenon. The Baloch rebels on the other side, Baloch rebels here. The Baloch rebels on the Pakistani side have sanctuaries on the Iranian side. Likewise, the Iranian Baloch rebels have sanctuary in Pakistan. So it's a really complicated situation. So I think that this area is probably, I would rate it much higher in terms of, instability and spillover, cross-border spillover, than any of the other areas because of the reasons that I explained. We can also talk about the Turkmen border, but the Turkmen are a much smaller community. They're not a very big minority. They're sort of they live in the northeast of Iran, in an arc that runs along the Turkmen border to the Afghan border. The Turkmen are also Sunni, but from Turkmenistan's point of view, depending on how bad the situation gets, this could become really problematic because the Turkmenistan capital of Ashgabat is only 15 miles from the Iranian border.
Okay. Yeah.
So, and they are already dealing with instability from the Taliban because they have a long border with Afghanistan. So they've been dealing with that in a very, it's a delicate balancing act that they've been trying to play there. Now, if you have another border, Iran, destabilize, then it's a huge problem for Turkmenistan because the Turkmenistan, society and state have remained insular, if you will. So they're not like Kazakhstan that have developed and they're out there and projecting influence and whatnot, a rising middle power, or Uzbekistan with 40 million people, approaching 40 million people, also playing on a regional scale. Turkmenistan is about 5-6 million people and a very sort of closed state and society. And this would really undermine their interests should things really get out of hand in Iran. And on the Iranian side, you have, large cities there. So this isn't sort of like if you will, a peripheral region in Iran. There's a huge population. Like the city of Mashhad is in that part of the region. And so it's not, Mashhad has its own dynamics. It's not the same as the ethnic Turkmen areas along the border, but nonetheless, there is a potential for concern for the Turkmen government should the Iranian state descend into chaos.
This is very helpful. I do want to switch some gear and talk a little bit about Central Asia in specific. In the event of the S7 reports that we recently published in Central Asia Center, particularly I want to start by talking about Kazakhstan. You've written a lot about Kazakhstan, and before we jump into the S7 project, you've written about Kazakhstan joining the Abrahamic Accord, and you talked about the region's effort to break this landlocked constraint, which is something we also talk about it and mention about it in the S7. How should, in general, before we open up this conversation, how do you think, if we were to step back and think about Central Asian states, how they should think about this Iranian turmoil? Should they think maybe this is their advantage to kind of break this dependency on Russia and China and Iran and just start building their own autonomy and maybe re-engage with the West? Or what do you think should be the approach given what's going on?
So let me just take a few minutes to explain what the perspective of Central Asian states like Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, the two dynamic economies of the region, have been before the Iranian crisis. From their point of view, they are landlocked. In the case of Uzbekistan, double landlocked. Okay, so To the north, there is Russia, so you don't have access to the outside world. Kazakhstan is an oil exporter, commodities exporter, and all its exports have to travel through Russian routes, and it's a dependency. So obviously, from a Kazakh point of view, they need to diversify.
Right.
Uzbekistan, is even in a more acute situation because it has borders with all of the other four Central Asian states, and it's in the center of the region. Now, if you look at a map, the shortest route for the Kazakhs and the Uzbeks and the Turkmens to the high seas runs through Iran. The problem of Iran has been that since 1979, Iran has not been open for business because of the sanctions.
Right.
So they, so the Kazakhs and the Uzbeks have been hoping that the Iranians and the Americans can reach an understanding whereby there is some sanctions respite and there's an ability to do business and trade. And you can build sort of infrastructure routes that come from Central Asia through Iran. They could come through Turkmenistan side because if Iran, the north of Iran, the central part of Iran, obviously is the Caspian Sea. So you can connect through the Caspian Sea if you are Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan, or you can come through the Turkmen areas, or you can go through the Azerbaijani border with Iran, which is in the northwest. So there's a lot of options here, but that assumes that Iran is open for business, which it is not. Okay, so this has been the hope that hey, sooner or later things are going to come to a point where Tehran and Washington will reach some form of accommodation. They will not become, solve all their problems, but enough to build sort of this infrastructure and allow for trade. I mean, India has been trying to develop the Shah Bahar port, which is outside the Straits of Hormuz, and it's in a very strategic location in the Gulf of Oman, and at the mouth of the Arabian Sea, and that's another route that Central Asian states are looking at. That okay, you know what, if we can get the political understanding between Washington and Tehran, then we can build this infrastructure, and that will provide us with a we don't have to be dependent on Russia. And of course, they've been trying to develop the Trans-Caspian corridor, middle corridor, through the Caspian Sea, through Azerbaijan, Georgia, and now more recently, the idea is to go through the Trump route, which connects Azerbaijan through Armenia, through the exclave of Nakhchivan, onto Turkey and then to the Mediterranean. But this is a complicated path. The shortest path is through Iran. And of course, you could go through Afghanistan and Pakistan, but Afghanistan is a very problematic state because of the regime. And it's in some ways as bad as the situation in Iran. Now, this was the hope. And now you have the uprising and the chaos.
Right.
So now the Central Asian nations are saying, well, hopefully everything gets resolved in a favorable way, a more moderate, reform-oriented regime emerges out of this messy transition, and that would be good for us. But they can't assume that that will happen. We just talked about how the Iranian regime and the state could come under a lot of strain and stress and not be able to even provide for security for their peripheral regions. So that's a problem. So in other words, while Kazakhstan does not have a border, Turkmenistan does, Azerbaijan does. And so again, is this going to lead to a situation that will address the landlocked nature of Central Asian states? Well, we don't know. And this is where sort of the Central Asian states are. The hope has always been that, hey, a deal between Iran and the United States will be very useful for us. But now the question is, what happens to the regime? because you can only have a deal if there's somebody there to deal with. What if the regime becomes incoherent? Then that becomes a bigger problem, a much longer term problem, and they're still stuck with their landlocked situation.
Right. And it looks like we still don't know what's going to happen in the regime. And it looks like from my understanding to your analysis, the Iranians' route is easier than all the route that is being suggested.
Shortest possible.
Or even through Azerbaijan or Turkey, that maybe it's more attractive if you would look at it. Is it the Azerbaijani Turkish route?
Yes, so the middle corridor or the Trans-Caspian corridor that runs
Right.
east-west
Right.
has its problems, but it's not as problematic as the
I
one through Iran. But if you just had to deal with, because what is a route? The
Right.
route is the most optimal route is the one that costs less to export. So, and those are usually measured in how much time it takes to get to your destination or to move goods from point A to point B. So this becomes a bit more complicated, the east-west, if in a perfect world, where Iran does not have these problems, this regime is in the rear view mirror, and there's a new government, new regime that's in power that is open to doing business, then this becomes the most favorable route for
Right.
the Central Asians. I mean, this is historically, if you look at history, the following the rise of Islam, the Arabs first took over Persia, and from Persia they went into Central Asia. So this is a connectivity that isn't new; it's
Right.
historical. It's
Right.
just in the last couple of centuries, perhaps a little more, it's been one of those that has been firewalled, largely because Russia took over large parts of most of Central Asia and the Caucasus. Then the Soviet Union took over, and we had the Iron Curtain, the Cold War. So the reconnectivity of these regions, the Middle East, South Asia, and Central Asia, and the South Caucasus, is something that isn't new. It's
Right.
just going back to what was, but the question is how? How can you establish this connectivity that can be good for people in all of the regions from a development point of view, from an economic point of view?
So speaking about connectivity, speaking about the rising tensions that we talked about, in general, we have seen that Central Asian states have historically avoided taking sides. When there is a conflict, when there is an issue in the region, we've noticed that a pattern of they don't take a side. Right now, we see that Iran politics is really in a crisis. There is a chaos. Russia is distracted with what's going on in Ukraine. China Belt and Road initiatives is weakening. Do you feel that this is, or do you see this as a moment for Central Asian states to step and be like, we are supporting this regional integration, we want to have our own framework, kind of the analysis that the New Lines has been pushing for the S7 framework? Do you see this is the right policy opportunity for them to take the lead on it, or not?
I think it is. I think it's an opportune moment. In fact, the New Lines Institute, myself and our colleague Eugene Chasovsky, we wrote a report on the Trans-Caspian corridor in October of 2023 for this regional connectivity project. So the Central Asians have been looking for opportunities because Russia has been weakening. China is, from a financial geoeconomic point of view, trying to dominate Central Asia and has made significant headway. But China has its own political economic problems that it has to deal with. There are limitations. So yes, this is a moment of opportunity. So if Iran on the other side of this crisis looks better, then all of a sudden that last 2 centuries of being landlocked is something that could become something of history. Central Asians, the Uzbeks and the Kazakhs, have been trying to deal with the Taliban regime, trying to make sure that, hey, look, whatever your radical ideology is, in the end, you need an economy. And
Right.
if you work with us, and maybe we can establish connectivity, which will be helpful. If you become a thoroughfare for our goods to go through the Indian Ocean, But then the Taliban regime has problems with Afghanistan, Pakistan.
Right.
The
Right.
Taliban regime has its conflict with Tajikistan. And
Right.
so again, it's a potential pathway, but it's blocked. And so currently the regional integration is happening east-west. And which is why you notice that this was like, I would say in November, perhaps, this past November, that the Central Asian states, the 5 Central Asian states, uh, asked Azerbaijan to join them to become the C6.
The C6, right?
And so, as for the S7, my view is that, yes, that's sort of like the desired optimal outcome. But I think it'll be a long time before Afghanistan. It's a big unknown. And Afghanistan has to also be factored in. Its future, the future of the regime and its stability has to be factored in with what's happening in Iran. Keep
Right.
in mind, the Iranian regime, the theocracy has failed. And so the Iranian regime had almost half a century of theocracy, more or less. And it had lots of oil that it could rely on. So if that model is floundering despite those resources, what is the chance that when this edifice begins to, and it is decaying already, but when change comes to Iran, can the Taliban keep their little emirate, isolated from all of this? I don't think so. I think there's going to be, and this is what the Taliban have to be worried about right now. So I think that the S7 model is a good model in the sense of an aspiration, but we have to be mindful of the limits and constraints of
Right.
what can happen in the near-term future, and because policymakers are interested in the art of the possible
Right.
or the doable. And so I think that the project sort of needs to proceed in a way where it sort of makes sense. And we can say, yes, the ultimate goal is S7, but while being mindful of what it is can be achieved in the short to medium term.
I do have one question about this in terms of realistic achievements. Do you think, just quickly, and then we can shift to another couple of questions I have about Russia and China in regard to Iran and Central Asia. So do you see that Azerbaijan, what role do you see for Azerbaijan, particularly in terms of connectivity? Because this is something we've talked about a lot in the S7. We talked about the importance of including Azerbaijan in any idea about connectivity. So I want to learn from you on your perspective on this question. When it comes to connectivity.
Yeah, I mean, look, the Azerbaijan is a Turkic state, just like the 4 Turkic states of Central Asia.
Right.
There's a lot of pre-existing connectivity, ethnic, cultural, linguistic. They already do a lot of business because it's easy to ship goods from, say, Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan and other parts of Central Asia, like Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan, through the Caspian to Azerbaijan. Getting it to the outside world going through Armenia is a second layer, which becomes a bit complicated, given that that route is still being developed. But absolutely, I mean, Azerbaijan, there's a reason why the Central Asian states asked Azerbaijan to be part of the
Right.
C6. So I think that there is just no other way around it. This is just the natural sort of, and bear in mind, Azerbaijan and Central Asian states are coming unto their own. They're sort of moving well past the legacy of Russia and the Soviet Union. Their own languages are now flowering. More people in each of these countries, especially the younger generation, speak the national language as opposed to Russian. Russian has become sort of the lingua franca of the older generations. And as time goes by, these countries are going to assert themselves. So yes, there is that common linkage, and it's historic. If this isn't in the modern era, you have nation states And a lot of these borders were drawn up by either the Soviets or the British or the French, and the United States inherited this architecture. But we live in a world of increasing connectivity, whether we like it or not, and not all connectivity is positive.
Right.
I mean, there's also negative connectivity, which we just discussed in the form of spillover of instability from one country to another. But nonetheless, there is an organic connectivity which, doesn't just extend to the Trans-Caspian region. It extends south into Iran, to South Asia, and of course the Middle East as well. I mean, look, the UAE and Qatar are doing a lot of business in Central Asian states. They're doing a lot of business with Azerbaijan. So I think that Azerbaijan, as a rising middle power, and along with Kazakhstan, uh, have a role to play in really leading this region towards a better future.
We talk about a lot about the Central Asians, and we talk about China and Russia. Something we don't talk a lot about it is, and I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on it, is Turkey, the Turkish influence. Can you help us understand where Turkey stands on these all geopolitical big issues, and where do you see it's going to be going, especially with Central Asia? I think this is something we're missing right now in this big picture.
Yeah, I mean, look, Turkey already has what is called the Organization of Turkic States, in which, Azerbaijan and many of the Central Asian states are part of it. Turkey sees itself as sort of the leader of this Turkic world, if you will, people of Turkic ethnic and linguistic backgrounds. And so Turkey has an ambition to project influence that far out. But Turkey also has constraints. Turkey is seeing opportunity on all fronts in its 360-degree, regional environment. So with Russia weakening, the Black Sea has opened up as a place for where Turkey will project influence in the years to come. Southeastern Europe, the Western Balkans, is an area that has been an old stomping ground of the Turks. They're trying to project influence there, but they run into Greece and that whole problem that they have with the Greeks. They already helped Azerbaijan win the war against Armenia, and Turkey established itself in what used to be traditionally a Russian sphere of influence in the South Caucasus. So with Azerbaijan's rise, and Turkey sees itself as partnering with Azerbaijan to have influence in Central Asia. So this becomes sort of a thoroughfare that runs east-west. Likewise, with Iran, pushed out of the Levant, Lebanon and Syria, and it's struggling in Iraq, Turkey sees an opportunity there as well. Turkey is already playing in the, further west in the Mediterranean basin with Libya. Then you can see Turkey moving into the Horn of Africa. Turkey has a relationship with Qatar. So Turkey is trying to play in multiple arenas in its environment, in its strategic environment. The constraint that Turkey has is its economy and its politics. So the economic situation has to greatly improve for Turkey to become sort of this, what it tries to be in terms of a great power, a major player in these regions. But then also we're looking at an approaching inflection point in Turkish politics. President Erdogan has been in power since 2003, 2002, 2003. And so that's a long time. And, his best days are behind him. He's aging. So what happens to his party as, he faces challenges from opposition groups, particularly the CHP, the Republican Party, and of course, its allies. So we're already seeing the ruling Justice and Development Party, the AKP, lose ground in the municipalities. So Istanbul, Ankara, Izmir, they're now controlled by opposition groups, the municipal governments. So, and this is something that President Erdogan acknowledged in the elections from a couple of years ago that, hey, you know, we took a beating at the polls. So there are many questions about Turkey's own domestic political economic evolution that have to be answered before we can say to what extent can Turkey take advantage of all these openings that are appearing on all of the fronts, east, west, north, south.
Do you think do you think based on Turkey, do you think considering the connectivity framework and the Turkish priority and politics, is this something the Turkish would encourage, not encourage, or where do they stand? Especially that so far we've seen them like kind of promoting a very different model of authoritarianism, like they're being more pragmatic but economically dynamic, but also they align with the Western politics on a lot of the issues. So I wonder where do they stand on this connectivity project?
I think they want this
Given,
connectivity
okay,
project. They
okay,
want to be able to lead it, to
right,
be
okay,
sort of the leader of this Turkic world, if you will.
right,
Hence the Organization of Turkic States, that
right,
it created, which also has Hungary as a member as well. And so this isn't something that the Turks take lightly. But then again, it's about your capability. Plus, there is the issue of which you raised, which is that uh, Turkey is trying to be a power aligned with the United States, but at
right,
the same
exactly,
time pursue its own regional interests.
exactly,
So what that means is that over time, there could be moments in which American and Turkish interests do not align.
right,
So then Turkey has to sort of play that balancing act and say, okay, and we've seen some of this before. I mean, with the war against ISIS, and the United States was more interested in Turkey taking the lead as a fellow NATO ally,
right,
a NATO member state. Hey, you're our best defense here against ISIS, so we are relying on you. From a Turkish point of view, it was geography. The problem was ISIS was not on its borders. On its borders are the Syrian Kurds. And so that was their priority. ISIS was not. And if ISIS is weakening the Syrian Kurds, then even though Turkey is not an ally of ISIS, actually they oppose each other, but it's sort of the enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of
right,
situation. And so
exactly,
that created a huge rift with the United States, where the United States decided, hey, okay, so if you're not willing to do it, then we're going to have to go with the SDF, or the YPG at the time, and which became the SDF,
right,
and which led to sort of the global coalition against ISIS, and then the defeat of ISIS. Now we're seeing a reversal back to sort of establishing relations with Turkey, and the Kurds, the sort of a rationalization of the American relationship with the Syrian Kurds. So these realities are dynamic. So there was the divergence of interests during the days of ISIS. Now there's a convergence of interests. But tomorrow, the Turks could pursue something that's not in the American interest. So this is something also that the United States, that the Turks will have to work out. The thing that is working for not just Turkey, but also Saudi Arabia, but also the Central Asian states, Azerbaijan, Pakistan, and we can go through the global list of countries, is the new US geostrategy, which basically says burden sharing and burden shifting, where the United States is not going to be doing the heavy lifting
right,
across the world as it has for 80 years. And what it's saying is we need allied and partner nations to take the lead in their particular regions. So these are opportunities for countries like Turkey, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, even I would say Pakistan, Saudi, to emerge. I'm not including Iran in this because Iran is a problematic state right now,
right,
and we don't know what will happen there. But yes, I mean, these are opportunities, but while the US is allowing them space to take the lead, but it's only natural that at some point, one or two of these countries engage in some form of policy direction that doesn't sit well with the US interest. And so then we could again see a tension between Washington and, Ankara, for example.
My last question about Washington, just how do you see the role of the current administrations with this regional challenges that we're talking about? What's your overview, your recommendations, and your analysis on this, just to wrap up?
I think that the Trump administration recognizes that the old system of doing things that we did for 80 years is no longer applicable. And this is a new world with its new challenges that has emerged in the last 3 decades. Yet the US was trying to manage this world, this changing, transforming world, with the tools of the past. So that part, I think the administration, in my view, understands very clearly. You can see it in the National Security Strategy document, and you can see it in the National Defense Strategy document that was released Friday night. And so, but the issue is operationalizing all of it. That's where you will need more skill and tact. There's also change within the United States happening that then constrains the US ability on the foreign policy front and vice versa. So I think that the key will be on how the principles are sound. Strategically, they're very sound. But how do you operationalize them? And this isn't something that, the Trump administration necessarily knows just yet. In fact, it doesn't have to be the Trump administration. It could have been somebody else.
Right.
And, you think back to the era of FDR, in which this new architecture of that age was established, that the order that we're now moving away from. Did FDR know everything that needed to be done? Did his administration? No, they took it one day at a time. And some things didn't work, some things worked out. So nobody knows. This is one of the things that we have to bear in mind in the policy community is we can't assume governments know where they will be a year, 2 years, 3 years from now. And so this is a work in progress. In other words, this is an opportunity for policy entrepreneurs like New Lines, like other think tanks, to come up with, okay, we understand your strategy. This is how best you can achieve your strategic objectives. So I would say that this is going to be interesting to watch. And it's going to be very commotive. It already is. And there's a lot of churn going on in the world. And it can become depressing and demoralizing for many. But I don't know, I always see the glass as half full, not half empty. So I'll just leave it there.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Bokhari, for your comments. We learned a lot, and we're so happy that you were our first guest. So thank you so much.
My pleasure.